Adrenal fatigue, a hot button term in medicine, no doubt. Many doctors take issue with this personification of an organ and the imprecise reference to its suboptimal functioning. So, probably a more vogue and more acceptable term to be using for this preclinical condition is adrenal dysregulation. Regardless, when cortisol levels are low and your adrenal glands are not functioning at their best to be able to handle the demands of life, especially all the stressors that are being thrown at us, the body and the brain suffer. This is part 2 in my adrenal fatigue series. In the first part, we went over the controversy surrounding medical precision in explaining terminology of a specific condition. I also discussed some of the underlying physiology related to adrenal fatigue. So if you missed that, there will be a link in the video description to part 1. In part 2, I'm going to discuss some of the symptoms. So how do you recognize if you may be struggling with this form of adrenal dysregulation? Some testing that can be done to rule out an underlying pathology, an actual disease process of the adrenal glands, or in the feedback regulation that helps the adrenal glands secrete cortisol. This is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis to be concise. And if there is a feedback problem with one of those specific organs, cortisol will not be secreted. So you have to look for underlying pathology before you can actually assess if it's just related to this quote unquote dysregulation, which is a preclinical condition of the adrenal glands. It isn't a pathology. So that's important to decipher. So we're going to go through the symptoms. We're going to go through the testing for the pathology. We're going to go through the testing for quote unquote adrenal fatigue or this HPA dysregulation. And then some things that some naturopathic and functional medicine doctors will likely do to help support somebody's adrenal glands and optimize their function for better health and vitality. So let's go ahead and get started. So again, just to catch everybody up in case you missed part 1 and just to remind you, adrenal fatigue is not an accepted medical diagnosis. It's more of a lay term and it's applied to a collection of nonspecific symptoms. These can be things such as body aches, fatigue, nervousness, sleep disturbances, and digestive problems. Because the adrenal glands do produce a variety of hormones that are essential for life, the medical term adrenal insufficiency actually refers to inadequate production of one of these hormones as a result of an underlying disease process. So that would be the medical term for the disease. And signs and symptoms of insufficiency and also include fatigue, body aches, unexplained weight loss, low blood pressure, lightheadedness, loss of body hair, and skin discoloration. Sometimes they can be hard to decipher. Now, in the article, Clinical Presentation on Stress, Cortisol, and Adrenal Fatigue, Dr. Wilson discusses some of the most common telltale signs of what he has seen in his clinical populations with this preclinical condition. One of them is this telltale kind of sign of a specific form of fatigue. And he says it's in about 85% of the people that struggle with adrenal fatigue or adrenal dysregulation. This is this early morning fatigue, even if someone has gotten enough sleep. And they often need caffeine or stimulants to get them up and running. They also feel more refreshed in the morning if they can sleep in a couple of hours. And sometimes they don't even feel awake until in the afternoon, even after lunch. They will experience a mid-afternoon lull, which oftentimes they'll grab more caffeine and even try to maybe consume some sugar and some fat. Now, there is a biological reason for these cravings because this would compensate for the low blood sugar, which is due to the low blood cortisol. Because your cortisol goes in these fluctuating patterns, hence why there's a low in the morning and then another low in the afternoon, because technically cortisol should be spiking at specific times. And there's also another lull around 2 to 5 p.m. for people with this form of dysregulation. It can go from about 15 minutes to 2 hours, according to Dr. Wilson, and they will either need to lay down or take a quick rest or just be out for the count for a couple of hours. And finally, if they stay up late enough, around 6 p.m., they'll get a second wind, and then this energy heightened between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. So that's kind of the circadian pattern of someone with this dysregulation in cortisol, which makes sense because cortisol and melatonin are hormones that regulate our circadian rhythm or our sleep-wake cycle. If that's dysregulated with low amounts, then the body physiology and energy will be off. Other signs and symptoms of adrenal fatigue that have been reported are decreased stamina and energy, just this general feeling of being run down and extremely tired, decreased productivity, lowered resilience. So lowered resilience would be more frequent illnesses, more time to recover from them, and a slower inability to rebound from stress. People will often crave salty foods because the adrenal glands also help with salt and electrolyte balance. They might feel these low blood sugar symptoms. As I mentioned, these blood sugar swings can occur because of the low blood cortisol as well. They can feel unrested even after sufficient sleep. A decreased sex drive, because when the body has low cortisol and it's operating to just try to get by in the day, you can imagine that's the last thing on someone's mind. They can have problems with focus, concentration, memory. A lot of times people whose reserves are low will be more irritable and intolerant because their nervous system is already on overload. So any additional thing is just like the camel that, the straw that broke the camel's back is the expression. They can feel depressed, overwhelmed, and they can experience mood changes. Now, some other signs and symptoms can be based on these overactive stress response and an underactive or hypofunctioning adrenal gland can be done with some preclinical signs. So some doctors might just notice and ask you if you have a sort of short fuse. That will be a sign that maybe the body's stress response is just on overload. Blood pressure deregulation. Now, oftentimes with high cortisol, you'll see higher blood pressure. With low cortisol, you tend to see lowered blood pressure and what they call orthostatic hypotension. Hypo is below, and then tension, again, low blood pressure. Now, what this is that if you move positions from lying down or sitting position and you stand up from that, the blood pressure will go lower and it'll be harder to recover. So people can feel dizzy when they stand. That is a sign of orthostatic hypotension, or one of the signs. People will also have these extended pupil dilation. So the flaps of their eyes will tend to stay dilated versus constrict. And this is a result of the nervous system. When your body is actually more relaxed, your pupils dilate less. So if people have that inability because they're under constant stress, their pupils are dilated looking for danger, right? Trying to take in more of the environment. So those can be some subtle signs that a doctor might look for that you can even kind of see if that's something that you're experiencing. It might be a sign that your adrenal glands aren't as functioning as optimal as they can in responding to stress at the best level they could be. Now, when we're talking again about adrenal dysregulation or dysregulation or preclinical condition, we always want to make sure there's not something more serious going on. So this is where a test for adrenal pathologies or a disease process will occur from a conventional physician. And most of the measurements are done related to a cortisol response from a stimulation. So these stimulations are usually hormones. So they'll either use ACTH, an insulin tolerance test, or CRH. Now I'll go through those, so no worries. ACTH is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that's secreted from the pituitary gland. So remember, in this HPA axis, we have the hypothalamus at the top, the pituitary in the middle, and the adrenal glands below. So we're coming in at the pituitary glands here, and that correlates to cortisol levels Again, because once the body secretes ACTH, it's going to release cortisol. So we'll look at the peak levels of cortisol in response to ACTH. An abnormal result could indicate a tumor or other problems either in the pituitary or in the adrenal glands itself. So there should be a response from the adrenal glands to that ACTH. Same thing with the insulin tolerance test, only we're using insulin. Again, there's this blood sugar insulin relationship with cortisol. Cortisol is related to insulin sensitivity. So low cortisol can cause where there's actually lower blood sugar, and there's this insulin, the body is really responsive to this insulin tolerance test. Someone's blood sugar can go super low. So that has to be definitely done with a physician. There's also been a test, because this is kind of a more advanced screening, and because someone's blood pressure going too low can cause issues and symptoms in and of itself if they have adrenal dysfunction. They have been proposing an alternative to this test called the glycogen stimulation test. So that's also something that isn't used as much, but something to be aware of that your doctor might do. CRH is corticotrophin releasing hormone. This is from the top line, the hypothalamus. And again, they're looking at, with CRH, do you get a response from the adrenal glands as expected? Some other testings to rule out pathology would be antibody tests to the adrenal gland itself, and then imaging. Now, if we're ruled out that there's an actual pathology, a tumor, a disease process, something going on in the pituitary or the hypothalamus, the next thing that an integrative doctor, naturopathic or functional medicine will likely do is, if they want to run some tests, run cortisol tests. Now, cortisol, again, it's on the circadian balance where it ranges in levels related to the time of day. So usually between 6 a.m. in the morning and 8 a.m. when most people are rising, cortisol will be the highest. It's a peak, it wakes us up, and that can be about 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter. Around 4 p.m., it's getting a little bit lower, between 3 to 10 micrograms per deciliter. Salivary cortisol markers, which measure free cortisol, can also fluctuate depending on the clock. And those will range depending on when the salivary test was done. Was it in the morning or was it done at late night? So that can range from like 2 to 22.63 nanomole per liters. So this should all be kept in mind. Some other tests that functional medicine labs offer are the CAR profile, not like the car you drive, but the cortisol awakening response. It's called the CAR panel. And that actually is a 6-point test in time where you collect cortisol over 6 periods of time to see if it's fluctuating appropriately in the circadian pattern, and then analyzing the awakening response, because that is very important to determine somebody's type of fatigue. And if they're really super tired in the morning, they're not producing cortisol. There's also a rhythm test with the CAR test, and that includes an additional adrenal stress profile, the CAR test, as well as a melatonin profile. And melatonin and cortisol, remember, they have this inverse relationship that are related to circadian balance. So if your cortisol is off and say it's low in the morning and high at night, your melatonin is going to be affected, and it's going to make it harder to sleep. So those are all some of the functional tests. So stepping back, we're just kind of show you where we've been before we get into the naturopathic and functional medicine support options. We've talked about adrenal fatigue, that it is a hot button term. So I should probably be saying adrenal dysregulation more throughout this video, but you know what I mean. We've talked about some of the signs and symptoms, some of the particular characteristics of the type of fatigue someone would have with this adrenal dysregulation, some of the additional signs and symptoms. some of the kind of at-home tests a doctor might do, such as the blood pressure, the irritability test, and the pupil dilation test. We looked at pathological tests that can be run to rule out an adrenal pathology, and those were related to hormone stimulation and cortisol response. And then we looked at the cortisol test itself to assess for adrenal dysregulation and what was going on with the cortisol levels throughout the time of the day. Now, one thing just to keep in mind that there's different reasons why cortisol will be low. And so these can be related to, again, the releasing factors or cortisol itself might be in low production. So we have to figure out why. Are there increased stimulating factors that are downregulating cortisol output? Hormones are in this delicate balance. So there's different things that stimulate hormone output and different things that maybe would make the output less likely to occur, things that can block it, inflammation, infections, certain disease processes that can occur. Increased receptor sensitivity to cortisol would decrease its output. So maybe somebody's just super sensitive at their receptor sites and they need less cortisol. Reduced availability of free cortisol. So sometimes if there is a lot of, say, insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction, sometimes free cortisol is not available, or there's also this kind of complicated relationship between cortisol and the thyroid gland. And then suboptimal effects of cortisol on target tissue, which can cause a relative cortisol resistance. You don't have to fully understand all of that, but the physicians that are watching probably are aware of these, and they're going to want to rule out why cortisol levels are low. So this is why a truly integrative practitioner is needed to look at some of these tests and to just assess if it's adrenal fatigue or something else. You want to consider the whole person, their compilation of symptoms, not just the lab results. All right. So one of the major things when we're addressing this form of adrenal dysregulation is, again, to get to the root cause. And usually it's linked to 4 common stressors: sleep, underlying inflammation, metabolic or blood sugar dysregulation, and emotional and physical stress. And those are all big topics, and it's going to depend on the individual. But right now, if we start off with some lifestyle factors that optimize sleep, movement, having fun and laughing is a good stress reliever. Positive relationships, toxic relationships can be very stressful on the mind and body. Limiting stress with mind-body practices. These are all things that can modulate cortisol and decrease stress on the body. Now, in the link in the accompanying article to this video, I have tips to different articles with optimizing sleep strategies and different videos for mind-body practices. I have a quick 10-minute video that goes through different naturopathic techniques. So you can go ahead and, again, that link will be in the video description if you want to dive deeper into these lifestyle factors. Another thing to consider is food and diet. Now, when your body is under excessive demands of stress, it uses up a lot of nutrients. So oftentimes when someone comes depleted, they need additional support. Things such as B vitamins, magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, protein. Protein is very important to balance blood sugar. It's important to help rebuild the body after it's been in a breakdown mode from stress. And probiotic rich or fermented foods, as long as someone isn't histamine sensitive or has issues with probiotics, this is really good communication via the gut brain. I have a lot of videos on gut brain. So again, that link will be in the video description in the accompanying article. It's important to note, because of diet culture, a lot of people might be calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, etc. Low blood sugar is super stressful on the body, just as high blood sugar is. So making sure you're properly nourished if you're tired is very, very important. So people with low cortisol do not do well with long-term fasting. They shouldn't be cutting carbs or skipping meals. Rather, they should have regularly scheduled meals where they're balancing protein, carbohydrates, and fats to balance that blood sugar. Otherwise, they're going to be fighting cravings, and they're going to feel lousy, and they're going to feel even more fatigued. Now, aromatherapy or essential oils are one of my favorite interventions for mind, body, and calming the stress response. This is for several reasons. They modulate brain signals or neurotransmitters. They shift our brain waves or how our brain is functioning. So they actually calm our brains down, but also help with focus. They calm our emotions. They enhance our cognition. They support our cellular physiology. So it's the aroma itself can affect mood, but also the constituents within the actual essential oils actually affect our nervous system and our cellular response patterns. They work directly with the emotional brain. Remember, your sense of smells linked to the amygdala or the emotional center of the brain. So there's an instantaneous shift in emotions. They evoke memories and transform mood through the aroma. They interact with odor receptors throughout our whole body, which influences biochemical pathways. We actually have like odor receptors in our body, which is super cool. And they modulate cortisol. Now, some oils have been shown to reduce cortisol in small clinical studies. This is clary sage, bergamot, and lavender. And other oils can actually modulate cortisol and energize the body. Things such as peppermint, rosemary, citrus oils, sage, and jasmine help with focus and, again, with more energy and helping with the stress response. So essential oils tend to be more balancers than driving one pathway or another because they have so many different constituents in just one drop. So it isn't just that you'll smell lavender and if your cortisol is low, all of a sudden it'll tank. More likely it'll calm the body and have an overall balancing effect. But I would tend to go for more energizing essential oils for somebody in the morning and the afternoon than I would go for lavender if their tiredness is related to this more adrenal dysregulation. And then there's herbs. You can use what they're called as nervine herbs, which are calming to the nervous system, and herbs that help the body adapt to stress, which are called adaptogens. Some herbs in the nervines category that you might be familiar with are valerian, German chamomile, hops, and St. John's wort. Adaptogens that are probably familiar to you, you've probably heard of ashwagandha, rhodiola, and holy basil. And then two of my favorite supplements for people that are having problems with modulating their stress response, specifically that work on cortisol, are L-theanine and phosphatidylserine. Phosphatidylserine tends to be more helpful for people with high cortisol, but it's also good for brain, the stress response, and memory and cognition. L-theanine is fantastic for modulating all different neurotransmitters and really helping focus and concentration, as well as calming the brain and even helping sleep. So we went through a lot regarding the HPA axis and downregulation of the adrenal glands and adrenal stress hormones, and we know that they can cause a variety of symptoms. It's important to get to the root cause and look at the triggers, because making sure that your adrenal glands are effectively responding to life can ensure a more vibrant, functioning body and mind. If you're struggling with symptoms of adrenal fatigue, measuring cortisol and making sure that you're correlating it with other symptoms as you rule out other pathologies is very important and should probably better be done with a naturopathic or functional medicine provider, because fatigue is such a huge symptom that expands vastly throughout various different disease processes and preclinical conditions. So it's good to have somebody there to support you if your fatigue isn't just related to lack of sleep and you haven't been able to get to the bottom of it. And various things can be done. Nourishment, lifestyle, herb supplement. We talked about aromatherapy. All of this can be personalized specifically for you with an integrative doctor working alongside your conventional care and your specialist if needed. So I hope you found that helpful. This is the end of the adrenal fatigue hot topic series, and I look forward to our next video. Make sure that, again, if you want more information, to look at the resources, to check out the links in the video description. There will also be more information on some of the classes I provide, as well as how to sign up for the newsletter and to make sure that you don't miss videos or other articles that aren't necessarily just posted on YouTube. And I also will be having an upcoming class that I think you'll really enjoy. It's incorporating mind, body, heart, spirit, and focusing on brain health for a better lifestyle and a better life to live your passion. So that is a project I've been working on for a long time, and it's getting ready for release in the upcoming future. So be sure to get on my list if you haven't already, and Please be sure to comment. I love reading your comments and I will definitely respond personally to each one. Have a beautiful either day or night whenever you're watching. And I thank you for your interest in this topic and for empowering yourself with health information.